Good afternoon. My name is John Weil. I'm Dean of the University Honors College, and it's my pleasure to make an introduction for our spring lecture series on climate change. With us today is Dr. Kate Pantelides, an Associate Professor of English and the Director of General Education English at Middle Tennessee State University. She has taught rhetoric, composition, and technical communication courses at both the graduate and undergraduate level. Her research addresses rhetorical genre studies, discourse analysis, feminist rhetoric, and writing program administration. Her work has been published in College Composition and Communication, Composition Studies, Computers and Composition and International Journal, and Composition Forum, among other venues. Let's welcome her today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here, though it is under different circumstances than I expected, and I had planned to have some interactive opportunities to work with our audience. So I do have some moments throughout my talk where I'll ask you to pause and do a little bit of work on your own, so I hope you take me up on that. And before I get started, I really want to extend my thanks to Dr. Weil and Dr. Phillips for having me today, and also to Elizabeth Williams. She's a doctoral student in the Department of English, and she helped me extensively with both the research and the analysis for this project that I'm going to talk to you about today, so thank you so much to Elizabeth. All right, so without further ado, I will get started. So the title of my talk today is Climate Rhetoric, Examining Genre Change in the Global Climate Report. So rhetoric itself has a pretty bad reputation, particularly in climate change debates where it's become synonymous with demagoguery and hot air. It also has a bad reputation because it's often reduced to the assumption that every issue has two simple sides, that there's a pro and a con, and often it's a simple conservative side and a simple liberal side. But this is a really oversimplified understanding of rhetoric that departs significantly from the way rhetoricians talk about rhetoric, how it's laid out, certainly in a lot of classical literature and contemporary literature. And this understanding has really significant problematic implications for real-world discourses. Because frequently, many issues don't have two sides, or they have millions of sides, and it's not this sort of simple pro or con. And we've seen so many discourses become problematically politicized such that we get caught up in the arguments themselves rather than the complex and then these often nuanced understandings of primary source data. And climate science is one such space, and that's where I'm going to really focus my remarks today. So instead of these problematic definitions of rhetoric that I argue are not conducive to public discourse, to generative public discourse, and really aren't in line with understandings of rhetoric as those of us who are rhetoricians talk about rhetoric in this sort of useful generative way, I want us to really move our understanding to a different definition, and that's one that Linda Walsh offers us. She says, rhetoric is the art of communicating in order to build and maintain just polities, or communities that must reason together to stay together. And that's the definition that I want to be working with today. So I'm going to give you a couple of lists. I'm into lists. I think they are useful, and particularly for organizing difficult information. So I want to start just kind of by telling you what I hope that you get from my talk today. First, I want you to develop an effective understanding of rhetoric, which maybe you already have, but hopefully sort of what we talk about can build on those ideas. One that recognizes rhetoric as the art of communicating within a given situation, and that's kind of Aristotle's understanding of rhetoric, but also one that recognizes how rhetoric allows communities to reason together about complex issues, not in these sort of pro-con arguments. I also hope that we can understand how rhetoric functions as a research method. And we're going to look in particular at genre analysis, which is a research method that I employ in my own work a lot and is really robust and generative. And I hope you will find that in your own musings. And then I'm going to ask us to use this understanding of rhetoric and genre analysis to examine some specific communication about climate science. All right, so this is how we're going to do that. Those are my goals, lofty goals, and my plan for our conversation today. I'm going to give you some background about the Global Climate Report. You may have seen this before. I'm pretty certain that everybody has heard it referenced, though you may not have looked at it on your own. I'm going to invite you to do that. And then we're going to look at the Global Climate Report and just kind of see what it looks like, how it's changed over time. And we'll consider the research method genre analysis to do that. We're going to perform genre analysis together just very, very briefly, and then see what we find. Okay, so that's my plan. The reason to do this, and the reason to sort of reclaim an understanding of rhetoric as generative as opposed to something that sort of shuts down conversation, is because to better understand the art of communication, and particularly communication problems, which I suggest discussion of climate change often is, it's useful to reason together, as this Linda Walsh definition encourages us to do. So my focus is going to be considering this document at the heart of climate science, the Global Climate Report, and one that is, again, taken up often as sort of two different sides, quote unquote, of the climate science debate. And I'm going to ask us to consider how rhetoric helps us understand primary source data on our own. So instead of just filtering primary source information through secondary sources, which is useful, but it's often what we do about climate science, what does it mean to actually look at the primary source data and be able to sort of understand it and thus filter secondary source information a little bit more easily for ourselves? So let me talk to you a little bit about the difference then between a primary source and a secondary source. And this can get really confusing because depending on the project you're working on, this idea of what's a primary source and what's a secondary source can sort of change. So a tweet can be a primary source or a secondary source. We're going to be looking at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and some of their discourse. That's usually primary source data, but you can also look at it in a different way. But generally, when we're reading the newspaper, that is somebody telling us in a secondary source interpretation about something that happened, primary source data. And so, that changes our perspective, of course, when we read somebody else's interpretation of primary source data. So I want to give you a definition here. A primary source describes a text or data that you're directly considering. So to situate your research, you might consider also some secondary research. If you have a research question, you might want to know what other people have thought about this issue that you're looking at. So for instance, of course, with climate change, you may have been reading extensively what others have said about climate change. But you might then go to some primary source documents like the Global Climate Report to better understand how these various authors got to the understandings that they did. So in fact, many researchers do this exact thing, that they'll go and conduct secondary source research and then they'll delve into their own primary source research. And this is a kind of difficult thing to understand. So I've given you this image of a bullseye, and I want you to think about the primary source data as the center of the bullseye. And then if you are doing analysis of that work and it's a primary source for you, then you're kind of this inner ring. Then, of course, there's going to be others who are going to examine that primary source data and have their own interpretations, but that'll be the outer ring, okay? So if you are closer to the data, that's your primary source. If you are reading somebody else's interpretation of the data, that's a secondary source. So those differences do matter, particularly when you're trying to better understand somebody else's interpretation of this work. All right, so I want to tell you a little bit more, now that I've kind of set things up, hopefully, about this primary source itself. The Global Climate Report is usually cited as the most well-known, respected arbiter of climate health. And it comes from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It is apolitical, it is intended to be apolitical. Scientific organization that aggregates empirical data, or data that's observable with the 5 senses, and then they share this information annually in the Global Climate Report. They also have many, many other opportunities on their site. There's monthly reports, so I really do encourage you to kind of get in there and take a look at all the many opportunities you can kind of find there. And then NOAA is located organizationally within the United States Department of Commerce and then within the National Center for Environmental Information. So that's where it comes from. And they give you, they give images, data, resources. The way that they describe themselves on their website is that NCI is responsible for hosting and providing access to one of the most significant archives on Earth, with comprehensive oceanic, atmospheric, and geophysical data. From the depths of the ocean to the surface of the sun, and from million-year-old ice core records to near real-time satellite images, NCI is the nation's leading authority for environmental information, if they do say so themselves. That is how they describe themselves. All right, so that's the background. What I'm going to invite you to do today is look at 20 years, more than 20 years of these global climate reports, and we're going to examine kind of how they change and how they develop. These are the reports since 1997, which is when the report became digitally available. So examining the evolution of this genre over time, over more than 20 years, helps us consider how climate rhetoric has changed as the audience has grown larger, and that has happened pretty much every year. And also as the consequences of the debate, according to climate scientists, have become much more dire and more significant. The beginning of the digital archive access coincides with the turn of the century and the transition from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0, which is when the internet became more interactive and widespread. And ironically, it's also, as numerous scholars point out, it's the beginning of the significant rhetorical divergence of the way that scientific discourse talks about climate science and then popular press coverage of climate science. So although this is a convenient sample, in that we can easily access this, it's also an important, significant sample because of this rhetorical change in the way that the Global Climate Report is accessible. As Nathan Crick and Joseph Gabriel remind us, the topic of global warming had first been broached by Guy Stewart Callendar as early as 1938. And then by the late 1960s, more than 5 decades of reliable temperature measurements had prompted widespread acceptance among climatologists of the basic hypothesis. But despite this general consensus, the concept of global warming remained largely confined to expert communities until the early 1970s, when severe droughts swept across the Soviet Union, India, Africa, and the American Midwest. So certainly not a new consideration, but the way that rhetoric has sort of addressed this issue has significantly changed, again, specifically in these 20 years that I want to look at with you. But they suggest also that it wasn't until more recently that climate change became what they call a public scientific controversy. And they define this as disputes about scientific knowledge that arise when technical authority intersects with public interests within salient political exigencies. So that's quite a definition. So this is one time when I would encourage you, as I noted at the beginning of my talk, to pause for a moment and just try to paraphrase this. Write it in your own words. What does this mean? All right, so I'll tell you what I think they mean. Essentially, they suggest that public scientific controversies arise when there's a conflict between what we as lay people understand about our world, what scientists observe about the world, and then how political ideologies line up with or potentially intersect with those perspectives and understandings of the world. All right, so before we go any further, I want to show you actually what this looks like, what the Global Climate Report is in effect. All right, so this is the first Global Climate Report. This is the report in its entirety. And I'll note just a couple things for you, that this please note on the report itself, which I'll invite you to go to, is actually really kind of in small font because it's something that they added after the report was actually offered. So this is sort of a subsequent note to let you know that there have been sort of changes and understanding of this information since 1997, but they still want to preserve that report for historical reasons. So I'm going to read it to you. I won't read you the note, but I'm going to read you what the report in its entirety was at the time. The global average temperature of 62.45 degrees Fahrenheit for 1997 was the warmest year on record, surpassing the previous record set in 1995 by 0.15 degrees Fahrenheit. The chart reflects variations from the 30-year average, 1961 to 1990, of the combined land and sea surface temperatures. So that's the whole thing. And I'm going to invite you to pause again and go ahead and look at it for yourself. Look at the way that the text is formatted, look at the differences in, certainly as I noted, the size of the font, look at the image itself, spend some time just kind of really taking stock of what you see. All right, going forward in time, let's look at the 2019 report. Okay, so you can see already that this is a very different document. Okay, here we are. All right, so this is the Global Climate Report in 2019, and you can see this is a very different document than the 1997 document. So first, you have this beautiful infographic with selected significant climate anomalies and events in 2019. So again, I would encourage you to spend some time with this. It's a really well done document. Again, this is rhetorically constructed, but using primary source data. So really interesting communication here. So spend some time checking that out. Then again, you can see there's supplemental material to start off, maps and time series. We have now multiple headings. There's the global temperatures. We have some charts, 10 warmest years. This is a new heading, certainly since 1997. Regional temperatures. There's images. Lots of information from all around the world. One just sort of simple change you might notice is in the 1997 report, all the temperatures were noted in Fahrenheit. And here, they're noted first in Celsius, and then they're noted in Fahrenheit. So just that simple change lets you know that this is a very different audience that this 2019 document is constructed for. And then, scrolling all the way down, this is something brand new for 2019, the ocean heat content. They note that ocean heat content is essential for understanding and modeling global climate science, since more than 90% of excess heat in the Earth's system is absorbed by the ocean. Further, expansion due to increased ocean heat contributes to sea level rise. Change in OHC is calculated from the difference of observed temperature profiles from the long-term mean. So again, please do spend some time with it. It's a really interesting document. I do encourage you to spend a little bit of time with that, and then just think about the differences between these two reports. 1997, much shorter, only one heading. And then 2019, we have 6 headings at this point. We actually have a brand new section, much, much longer. All right, so I want you to certainly think of that on your own, but I'm going to note just a couple of the differences that I saw. So first, in 1997, as I noted, just one section, and that's called the Global Temperature Index. 2019, there's 6 sections, and then this brand new section introduced in 2019 called Ocean Heat Content. The most frequent words in 1997 are climate, on 17 was the most used word. Of course, you know how short that paragraph was. Then global, report, national, information, annual, January, monitoring, search, state, data, ice, NOAA, snow, temperature. A lot of these are sort of common sense. And when you're only doing what is called content analysis for such a short paragraph, it's maybe not as indicative of huge findings. Again, content analysis is when you kind of count the various things in a text. You see how many times it shows up. This is a much more robust method when you're looking at something so long. So here in the 2019 report, you see that the most frequent word was record, 71 times. Temperature, 60. Warmest, 44. Year, average, set. Ocean, maximum, new. Land, January. National, precipitation, temperatures. So if we had more time, we could spend time with kind of each one of these words and find out what do they mean? What are the occasions in which we see record so many times? What is the co-location, meaning what is record next to? What what other words are right next to it, what is the context, and how is that meaningful. But we only have so much time, so we're going to keep thinking about just some of these basic overall things we're seeing. In 1997, only 1 image. 2019, 7 images, 3 tables. The 1997 report, only 97 words, and that does include the updated version, which has this sort of note. And then the 2019 report is 4,270 words, very significant changes. One notable deviation in the 2019 report, I read some of the ocean heat content ocean heat content section to you, but it closes with this. The ocean heating is irrefutable and a key measure of the Earth's energy imbalance. The excess greenhouse gases in the air trap more heat inside the climate system and drives global warming. So this emphasis is mine. I added it. This is particularly interesting because certainly this is the first time we've seen this section, but this is the first time that NOAA ever used the word global warming in this entire corpus of more than 20 years of online global climate reports. That's interesting. That's significant and a rhetorical departure because they do seem very committed to using language that is not politically charged, that is apolitical. And so we can spend some time trying to understand, what does this mean? So what just happened was we performed genre analysis. We did it in about 5 minutes, so we didn't spend a lot of time. It was kind of a really quick, brief overview. But this is a really powerful method. So even just in spending 5 minutes looking at these 2 different climate reports, we can see a huge change in the rhetoric over more than 20 years. So I want to offer a couple of definitions to put words to what we just did, to make sense of, through our lexicon, the process that we just went through. So first of all, as I noted at the outset, this definition of rhetoric that I really like, that I think is useful for us, is that rhetoric is the art of communicating in order to build and maintain just polities or communities that must reason together to stay together. And then this definition that I want to add is one of genre. And this is, of course, key to the method I've been talking to you about, genre analysis. And genre is a conventional response to a typified rhetorical action, or a communicative situation that occurs frequently and in response to an exigency or communicative need. So I'm still using all kinds of jargon there, so I do want to break it down and talk about what that actually means. And I want to give you an example. So all the following are genres, or types of conventional responses: menus, syllabi, tweets, receipts, forms, surveys, speeding tickets, film reviews, etc. These are all genres that we come into contact with in our everyday lives, and often genres talked about as like a type or a category, but I do want to use this sort of more extensive understanding, because it's not just that a genre is a category, it responds to something. So let's talk about menus as a genre. Menus are really interesting because they have a very clear purpose. A menu usually has information about what you can buy at a restaurant. It usually has prices, usually has sort of a description, and all of those things are driven by a particular need. And that need is the exigency, or the problem, sort of communicative problem that a genre answers. So the problem or exigency is, I'm at a restaurant, I want to eat, I don't know what my options are. And so the menu comes and solves that communication problem. And now I know, here are the things that I can buy, this is what they're going to cost, and I go from there. All right? Same thing with a syllabus. At the beginning of a semester, a faculty member provides a syllabus because he or she wants their students to understand what the expectations are for the course. Students want to understand what the expectations are for the course. Everybody is happy. So that's the exigency. It's the beginning of the semester. Students need to understand, faculty need to communicate, and then we have a syllabus. So there's this really nice relationship between exigency and genre. And exigency is also talked about as kairos. This is a classical Greek word that helps us understand how rhetoric functions. And this is another one of Walsh's really nice definitions. She says, Kairos is perhaps the central concept of classical rhetoric. It describes a unique moment in time and space when words can change the world. And that again, I think is a really nice sort of understanding of how rhetoric functions. It comes from the Greek word for an opportune opening, such as a gap in an opponent's defenses, or the moment when the warp threads separate to allow the weaver's shuttle to pass through. It is sometimes translated as exigence. So it's this kind of timely moment in time where you need a particular answer to a problem. So then thinking more specifically about genre analysis. When we're looking at a genre, we're trying to understand its response to an exigency. So we're looking at the Global Climate Report. That's the genre we're interested in today. And the exigency is trying to communicate climate science to an audience interested in this empirical data. And so when we're looking at genre analysis, though, we're trying to understand what are the conventions of this genre? What are sort of the norms and expectations? For instance, let's go back to menus. The conventions of a menu are that there's probably prices, there might be pictures, there might be descriptions of the food there, etc. And how do we know this? Because we've had experiences with restaurants. So even though we're not usually tapped into our genre awareness, we don't think we have awareness of all these conventions in our life, we really do. When we go to read a menu, we expect particular things. When we go to look at a syllabus, we expect particular things. And when something happens in that particular occurrence of a genre that we didn't expect, then it gets super interesting. So that's a deviation. Genre deviations are the unexpected choices that some composers make. Deviations to genre convention are usually very telling. So again, going to this menu example, if you go into a restaurant and all of a sudden there's no prices on the menu, what does that tell you? Maybe I need to leave. Maybe I hope somebody else is paying, because that's probably suggesting this is an expensive place. Maybe this is outside of my income bracket, or maybe I'm totally fine and happy and I'm just going to order whatever I want. But that is a deviation. That's not what we're usually expecting. And when we're doing genre analysis, that's the kind of thing that we're looking for. So that's an absence. Sometimes a deviation is something that's not there. Sometimes it's something that is there. So for instance, if you see pictures on a menu, what might that suggest? Maybe we expect that there's going to be speakers of multiple languages here. Maybe this is a tourist spot. Maybe it's for kids. Maybe this is a kids menu and we're not expecting them to be able to read and we're going to have a picture. Maybe it is food that the folks who own the restaurant think is unfamiliar to people, and so they want to have pictures so that they're more comfortable ordering that. So all of these deviations are what we really want to key into when we're looking at genre. And that's where sort of genre analysis is so powerful. So I hope you're already starting to think, if I were to look at one genre and look at multiple artifacts within that genre, I can get a lot of information and really start to understand how genres speak to us. And that's what rhetoric does. Genres in all communication is constructed. And when we tap into how it's constructed and look at it more clearly with this understanding of rhetoric and genre awareness, we can make some really powerful interpretations for ourselves. So this is what we're trying to do. We're looking at understanding the exigency for a particular genre, trying to understand essentially the problem that a genre is trying to solve, the timeliness of its delivery. So what does it mean that in 2019, for the first time, NOAA is using the word global warming? That is a deviation, and what does that suggest to us? What are the conventions of the particular genre? So not just what is different, but what is the same every time, and how is that meaningful? And then how are the various deviations, as I've been noting, how are those meaningful? All right, so I talked to you about the beginning of digital access to the Global Climate Report, 1997, and we looked at 2019, the end, but what happened in the middle? I really encourage you to spend time on your own kind of looking, but I just want to highlight some deviations for you in the meantime to kind of give you a sense. So 1997, the warmest year on record at the time, the first year of digital availability for the Global Climate Report. 2000 is the only annual report that was not available from 1997 to 2019. By 2005, we have 4 different sections. We have global temps, regional temps, global precipitation, and references. So that change has happened, sort of over time. In 2010, the 3 most frequently used words are record, warmest, and temperature. That's pretty much in keeping with what we saw in 2019 as well. In 2015, that's the first time that a monthly temperature average was 1 degree Celsius above that normal average. And then in the last 5 years, we've seen some consistent changes. So in 2016, at the time that was NOAA's warmest year in 137 years of recording temperatures. In 2017, that was the 3rd warmest year on record. In 2018, 11 of 12 months ranked among the top 5 ever recorded. In 2019, that was the 2nd warmest year in 140 years recorded. 2016 was still the record. And then 2020, we don't have, of course, an annual report, but in January, that was the warmest January in 141 years of records. All right? So NOAA is not interpreting this data for us. They're giving us this data. Of course, we could spend some more time doing some rhetorical analysis and genre analysis of how this work is constructed, but they're not trying to do spin. They're not trying to do interpretation as much as possible. They're trying to offer us sort of some of this empirical data. Okay, so what do we do with this? How do we make sense of all this work? A couple of things. So I want to first just kind of think about the Global Climate Report itself. And it is, again, fascinating document. You could spend hours and hours there if you want to. And I encourage you to just look at it a little bit more for yourself. And then think about what you think those conventions are, what you think the deviations are, and how are those meaningful? What is interesting to you? Then go and look at some secondary sources. Look at how this has been written up in a scholarly way in journals. Look at how this is written about, particularly in Nature. Then you might go and look at how this information is written up in sort of just journalistic opportunity. So very, very different rhetoric in all of those spaces. But if you have this sort of understanding of the primary source data on your own, you're in a much stronger position to understand those secondary sources. So NOAA has significantly changed the way that they communicate climate findings in the last 2 decades. Certainly we see that the report has gotten much longer, significantly longer. There's more images available. There's much more sort of a global perspective, and we see that with a shift to focusing on Celsius, with Fahrenheit as sort of a secondary measure. We also have much more attention to our attention is drawn by the way that headings sort of organize the information. Record temperatures and severe weather has increased nearly every year in the last 2 decades, with every year from 2015 to 2020 replacing new records. And you see that actually pretty much throughout those 20 years, but it was a little bit more punctuated in the last 5 years. And then NOAA is purposeful in not using politically charged language to describe rising temperatures. Instead, they attempt to let the data lead and highlight findings with the use of changing genre conventions, such as these new section headings, the ocean content, heat content, for instance. So we could spend a lot more time looking at the Global Climate Report, but I do want to think sort of on a broader scale, what about tools? And what about sort of an understanding of how to read primary source data sort of going forward when it comes to any sort of public scientific controversy, or understanding the relationship between primary source data and then secondary source analysis of it. So the Global Climate Report is a rhetorical, constructed document. However, the fact that a document is constructed does not make it untrue, suspect, or subject to simple pro-con debate. So certainly analysis, but not this simple pro-con debate. All communication, whether or not we like it, is rhetorical, and all communication is constructed. And we need to be able to read documents rhetorically. So again, sometimes there's this concern that, well, if something is constructed, then it's bad, or if we know that there's an opinion there, then it's wrong. it's just kind of impossible to escape opinions and construction. That's just how we communicate. But if we have more effective understandings of how that communication works, then we can reason together, as Linda Walsh encourages us to do with rhetoric. The reminder of, again, how rhetoric functions, it's both a tool to communicate and a tool for understanding communication. So whether or not we use it, we are always using rhetoric. Often we're trying to persuade people. Often we're trying to communicate our understandings, but we always are using rhetoric. And the more we're sort of in tune with that, the more effective we can be in communicating and then understanding other people's communication. Genre analysis is a rhetorical research method for examining differentiation across documents, a tool that helps us better understand how texts speak to us. So certainly, next time you go and read a menu, I would encourage you to think about what's there and what's not there, what that tells you. Your syllabus, what's there, what's not there, what does that tell you? As we're all receiving a lot of information right now about coronavirus, what's there, what's not there, what does that tell you? Go to the CDC and see how the way that the coronavirus is discussed might be different than an email that you receive from MTSU, how that might be different than how it's covered in the popular press. So not suggesting that any of these are wrong, just that they're going to be different, and try to understand those genre conventions and those deviations. Better understanding primary source data is powerful. It is a powerful step to effectively analyze and filter secondary source interpretations. So both primary source and secondary source understandings of data are necessary, important, and they work together. And sometimes we don't do that extra work to understand the primary source data, and it makes our understanding of secondary sources, when we do that, even richer, even more effective. So my kind of final takeaway for you all, my conclusion, is that ultimately it's going to be up to you to decide how to adopt rhetoric to address the findings of climate science, and then discussions of what kind of rhetoric will have broad uptake and impact. So with climate science and then all other public scientific controversies, I encourage you to engage with primary source data. Sometimes we're afraid of it. I think it's fantastic, obviously. So I hope you might take my suggestion and spend a little bit more time with it. And then develop an understanding of how primary source documents speak to us, and use that understanding to filter and examine subsequent secondary source interpretations. So I hope that was useful and interesting to you all. I really appreciate your watching and you all here listening. And I'd be happy to answer questions. So if you want to email me, I'd be happy to discuss any of this further. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.